The night was cruelly cold, the kind of night where silence itself froze in the air, where every breath turned into mist that immediately disappeared into nothingness. Snowflakes drifted down from the dark sky, coating the city in white, muffling the usual sounds of traffic, laughter, and life. The street lamps glowed weakly through the storm, throwing soft halos of light onto the icy pavement, and on one lonely corner of the city stood a bus stop bench, painted green once but now chipped and worn from years of use. Upon that bench, curled into herself like a fragile bird caught in the storm, lay a little girl no older than 7 or 8. Her thin beige coat was several sizes too big, her small legs tucked tightly under her, and her head rested on her arm as if it were the only pillow she had ever known. The bitter wind cut through her clothing and made her shiver even in sleep, but exhaustion had claimed her, forcing her to surrender to dreams even in the most uncomfortable place. She looked like she belonged to no one, forgotten by the world. And it was in this moment, when the city seemed heartless and blind, that fate chose to intervene in the form of a man who had never before slowed down for anything or anyone. Adrian Cole was a name that carried weight in every financial district across the country. He was a self-made millionaire, a man whose empire of businesses spanned hotels, real estate, and investments. His face was familiar on magazine covers, his sharp eyes and confident smile often cited as the mark of a man who never lost, who never hesitated, who always had a plan. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded attention without saying a word, the kind of man feared by rivals and admired by allies. But Adrian Cole was also the kind of man who, somewhere deep inside, had locked away all traces of softness, of emotion, of the boy he once was. To build his empire, he had cut himself off from vulnerability, believing that compassion was weakness and mercy was a distraction. Tonight, he had just finished a high-stakes meeting at a luxury hotel downtown. His sleek black limousine waited for him, his driver ready to escort him home to his penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline. The snow fell silently on his shoulders as he stepped out, adjusting his charcoal gray overcoat, his leather shoes crunching lightly against the frozen ground. He was prepared to step into the warmth of his car, to continue his endless cycle of work, strategy, and success. But then, his eyes landed on the bench. At first, he thought his eyes deceived him. What child would be sitting outside at such an hour? But when he looked closer, he saw the truth. This wasn't a waiting child, this was a sleeping child, curled up against the biting cold, her small body trembling slightly. Something inside him faltered. He stopped walking, his breath clouding in front of him as he turned toward the sight. His bodyguards, used to his fast and purposeful pace, almost collided with him before realizing he had frozen in place. Adrian ignored them. Slowly, with steps quieter than the snow itself, he approached the bench. As he drew near, the reality of the child's condition struck him like a blow to the chest. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her hair tangled and dusted with snowflakes, her shoes worn down as though they had walked miles without rest. She looked like she belonged to no one, like the world had already abandoned her. Adrian's throat tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. He crouched down beside the bench, his expensive suit brushing the icy ground, a gesture so unlike the Adrian Cole the world knew that even his driver blinked in shock. With a careful, almost trembling hand, he reached out and gently laid it on her back. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. For a brief second, their eyes met, his sharp, calculating gaze softened into something human, and her tired, frightened eyes widened at the sight of a stranger. She looked like she might scream, or run, or curl deeper into herself, but then she saw something in his face. Not danger. Not anger. Something else, something she hadn't seen in a very long time, safety. "It's all right," Adrian whispered, his voice low and warm, so unlike the commanding tone he used in boardrooms. "You're safe." She didn't speak. She simply stared at him, her lips trembling as she clutched the oversized coat tighter around her thin frame. He noticed she had no gloves. The cold had bitten her fingers to rawness. His chest tightened again. Without another thought, he pulled off his own expensive cashmere scarf and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. She froze at first, then pulled it closer, holding onto it as though it were the only lifeline she had left. Something inside Adrian shifted, something he had long buried under layers of power, wealth, and pride. Before he could stop himself, the words slipped from his lips, "Come with me." The driver hurried over, his face pale with confusion. "Sir, is everything all right?" Adrian didn't even glance at him. His eyes were still locked on the girl. "Prepare the car," he said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "She's coming with us." The driver opened his mouth to protest, but then closed it again. He knew better than to question Adrian Cole when he spoke with such finality. Slowly, Adrian extended a hand toward the girl. She hesitated, looking at it as though unsure whether it was a trap or a miracle. For a moment, she almost pulled back into herself, ready to let the cold claim her again. But something, maybe the warmth in his voice, maybe the promise in his eyes, made her reach out. With trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. His large hand closed gently around hers, and that was it. A decision had been made, a line crossed. In that single moment, Adrian Cole's life changed forever. The ride back to his penthouse was silent, except for the soft hum of the car engine and the occasional sound of the girl's stifled breaths. Adrian sat beside her, watching her out of the corner of his eye. She was so small in the vast leather seat, her head barely reaching the headrest, the scarf wrapped tightly around her like armor. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stared out of the window at the falling snow, her eyes reflecting a sadness far too old for her young face. Adrian's chest tightened again. He didn't know what he was doing. He was a CEO, not a savior. He didn't have time for this. And yet, he couldn't look away. Something about her reminded him of himself, years ago, before the world hardened him, before he decided emotions were weakness. When they arrived at the penthouse, the staff looked on in shock as Adrian walked in with a little girl in his arms. He carried her as though she were made of glass, careful not to wake her fully though her eyes blinked open now and then. "Prepare a room," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. The head housekeeper hesitated only for a second before nodding. Within moments, one of the guest rooms was being prepared with fresh sheets, warm blankets, and even a stuffed toy pulled from storage. Adrian placed her gently on the bed, watching as she clutched the scarf even in her sleep. For the first time in years, Adrian stayed in the room, simply watching. The next morning, as sunlight spilled through the tall windows, Adrian sat at the dining table, reading files but not seeing a single word. His thoughts kept drifting back to the little girl. He finally set the papers aside, stood, and walked toward the guest room. When he entered, she was sitting up, the blanket around her shoulders, her hair messy but her eyes clearer than the night before. She looked at him warily, as though unsure whether he would send her back out into the cold. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "Lila." Adrian nodded slowly. "Lila. That's a beautiful name." She lowered her eyes, clutching the blanket tighter. He crouched down to her level, his voice calm. "You're safe here, Lila. No one will hurt you." Her eyes flickered to his, searching for truth. For a moment, Adrian worried she would see through him, see the man the world knew, the ruthless CEO, the calculating strategist. But she didn't. She simply nodded slightly, as though she wanted to believe him. Adrian rose, standing by the window as memories of his own childhood crashed over him. The nights he had spent alone after his mother's death. The way his father buried himself in work, leaving Adrian to fend for himself emotionally. He had promised himself he would never feel helpless again. But now, here was a child, fragile and small, reminding him of everything he had once been. He clenched his fists, torn between walking away and stepping into something he didn't understand. By the end of that day, Adrian made a decision. He would find out everything about her. Where she came from, what she had endured, why she had been left alone in the snow. And more importantly, he would decide what role he would play in her life. For the first time in years, his life was no longer about business deals, profits, or expansion. It was about a little girl named Lila, and the strange, unexpected bond that had begun the moment he said the words, "Come with me." And as night fell again, Adrian stood by the window of his penthouse, watching the city lights sparkle against the snow. Behind him, in the warmth of her new bed, Lila slept peacefully, holding onto the scarf he had given her. Adrian's lips parted, and he whispered to himself words he had never spoken aloud, "This is only the beginning."